On the surface, the story of Chelyabinsk-40 sounds like Cold War fiction, a closed city in the Ural Mountains, a code name in place of an address, and a nuclear complex called Mayak that processed spent fuel for a superpower racing to master the atom. But this place was very real. It is now known as Ozersk, and if you ever find yourself near its perimeter, you'll see the clues in plain sight: security checkpoints, restricted roads, and a sense that the past has not entirely ended. To understand why a state would build a secret city, we need to rewind to the late 1940s. The United States had just demonstrated the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union would stop at nothing to catch up. Deep inside the Urals, far from prying eyes and potential attack, the Mayak complex rose at speed. Reactors, reprocessing lines, cooling ponds, and, out of sight, waste tanks holding some of the most dangerous materials on Earth. The workers recruited to Chelyabinsk-40 were promised a better life. Within the fences, extra rations, theaters, schools, pride, and the intoxicating idea of building history. Outside the fences, rumors, code names, and families who could only guess what their loved ones did for a living. Entry required passes. Mail was censored. Maps showed a forest where a town stood. In a country of scarcity, closed cities offered comfort at a price people could not see. But even before the famous explosion, the invisible bill was coming due. Act 1. A river that glowed at night. Nuclear weapons programs create waste. Mixtures of long-lived isotopes that don't care about borders or politics. In those early years, standards were primitive. Liquid waste was discharged into the Techa River, a lifeline for dozens of rural villages. People drank it, cooked with it, bathed in it. Their animals grazed along the banks. Children played in the shallows, fascinated by water that sometimes shimmered at dusk. Doctors began to notice strange patterns: anemia without explanation, burns that appeared after nothing more than a swim, teeth and hair falling out. Livestock miscarried. Villagers whispered about a heated river and sickness that follows the water. Some were moved from their homes. Others were told not to worry. The truth is more uncomfortable. They were never told enough to protect themselves. Inside the fences, Mayak hustled to expand. Reprocessing lines separated plutonium from spent fuel. Cooling ponds received heavily radioactive components. And beneath the ground, a field of massive steel storage tanks held concentrated liquid waste, stewed chemistry that demanded constant cooling and constant attention. Act 2. September 1957. The night the Earth spoke. On a cool evening in 1957, a routine that had been safe only on paper started to collapse. One of the underground waste tanks, a giant cylinder filled with a dried, unstable salt cake of highly radioactive residue, lost its cooling. Heat rose slowly, then relentlessly. Chemical reactions accelerated. Pressure built. Whatever alarms went off did so inside a system designed to keep secrets, not to leak them. And then the Earth spoke. People miles away reported a thud that seemed to come from beneath their feet, followed by a dull glow on the horizon. At Mayak, an explosion ripped through the storage field. This was not a nuclear detonation, it was a chemical blast. But the substances hurled into the air were as dangerous as any weapon. A towering plume climbed into the night and drifted with the wind, laying down an invisible scar across farms and forests. Later, scientists would call it the East Ural radioactive trace, a footprint of contamination stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Estimates vary because official numbers were hidden for decades, but the release was enormous. Millions of curies of radioactivity, including strontium-90 and cesium-137, scattered across the countryside. Dust settled on roofs and haystacks, on children's hands and supper plates, and on a land that had no reason to be afraid of the sky. Act 3. Evacuation without explanation. In the hours and days after the blast, teams fanned out with dosimeters and clipboards. Some wore respirators. Most villagers did not. Trucks rolled into hamlets with instructions: pack quickly. People were told they would return in a few days. Many never did. Dozens of villages were evacuated over time. Houses were bulldozed or burned, wells filled, fields plowed under to bury topsoil hot enough to frighten even the experts. But this is the part that bends the mind. The world heard nothing. To preserve secrecy, officials used a different name on internal reports. Kyshtym, drawn from a nearby city that did appear on maps. It was as if by renaming the disaster, one could erase the place it truly happened. For years, the event lived in whispers, a flash, a sickness, a convoy of buses at midnight. The people who knew were warned not to speak. The people most affected didn't know what to say. The men and women who cleaned up, liquidators before Chernobyl made the word famous, worked with shovels and bare courage. Forest belts were cut and buried to form radiation shields. Contaminated structures were dismantled board by board. Roads were scraped and re-graveled, and still the Geiger counters clicked. Inside the closed city, life stayed normal by design. The theaters played. The cafeterias served. Children walked to school past fences that kept danger out, or in, depending on how you look at it. Mayak kept running. The state, after all, still needed plutonium. Act 4, the lake that shouldn't exist. If the story ended there, it would already be almost too heavy to tell. But the Urals have another secret, an innocuous blue shape on old maps called Lake Karachay. During the frantic early years, Karachay became a dumping ground for highly radioactive liquids, the kind of place you don't walk toward unless you are absolutely sure you need to. For a while, water covered the shame. Then came the droughts of the 1960s. As the lake level dropped, radioactive mud cracked in the sun. A dry east wind did what wind always does in the Urals. It lifted dust and carried it across the landscape. People miles away breathed in contaminated particles. Some would only learn decades later where their cough began. Eventually, the lake was filled in, sealed with concrete blocks and soil, an engineered tomb for something that should never have been exposed in the first place. It was a practical solution. It was also an admission. The past had a habit of clawing its way back to the present. Act 5. The secret that grew teeth. For a while, the disaster was dismissed abroad as a rumor, a Western fantasy about Soviet incompetence. But in the 1970s, Soviet scientists and dissidents began to speak carefully but clearly. One name stands out: Boris Medvedev, a biologist who compiled testimonies, odd medical reports, and migrated maps into a narrative that refused to be silenced. Slowly, the pieces clicked. A secret city, a reprocessing plant, and a major accident in the autumn of 1957. It took until the late 1980s, amid the political thaw of Glasnost, for official acknowledgement. When maps were finally shown, a crooked swath of the Urals glowed with the outlines of evacuation zones, river bands, and forbidden forests. It wasn't just the single explosion, it was a timeline of cumulative harm. River releases in the early 1950s, the 1957 blast, the 1967 dust event, and decades of underreported exposure. By then, what had been an open secret became a difficult truth. This was, depending on how you count, one of the worst nuclear accidents of the 20th century, ranked by some analysts just behind Chernobyl and later Fukushima. But classification isn't the point. People are. Consider the families along the Techa. Grandparents who remembered being told not to use the river yet had no other water. Children who grew up thinking the metallic taste in their mouth was normal. Doctors struggling to connect patterns while told not to write those words in the chart. The burden fell unevenly, as it always does. Some were evacuated promptly. Others lived for years in what would later be red zones on official maps. Act 6. Life inside a closed city. What did it feel like to live in Chelyabinsk-40 through this? Accounts from former residents are complex and often contradictory, pride and fear in equal measure. There was a genuine sense of mission. They believed they were defending the motherland. There was also denial, the kind that glues a life together when the facts would break it. Inside, the city functioned like a well-oiled machine. Streetcars ran on time. Libraries were stocked with carefully chosen books. Workers received bonuses, better housing, and better food than their counterparts elsewhere. In a country where shortage was a constant, abundance felt like truth. Yet there were cracks. Wives noticed husbands who came home too tired from the shop. Workers compared dosimeter badges in private. Children played a game they called Mayak without knowing what it meant, mimicking the guarded gates and stamped passes they saw every day. At night, the smokestacks glowed faintly, and the sky over the complex sometimes pulsed with a color no one could name. Act 7. The cost, counted too late. When the archives opened just a little, researchers finally traced the long-term health impacts. Increased cancers in certain cohorts, immune disorders, and a cluster of conditions that correlate strongly with chronic exposure. To this day, you will find studies that cautiously map a geography of risk along the Techa and around the old evacuation zones. The numbers vary, the signal is consistent, and still the area lives. Ozersk remains a zato, a closed administrative territory with controlled access. Mayak, modernized and still operating in various capacities, became a symbol of both resilience and reckoning. The cleanup continues in layers, monitoring groundwater, fencing contaminated forests, and maintaining the engineered tomb of Lake Karachay. This is what it looks like when a civilization decides that forgetting is not an option, but silence is still convenient. Act 8. What we choose to see. People sometimes ask, was it worth it? The weapons, the prestige, the bragging rights of a superpower? That's a political question with a moral undertow. Here's another. What do we owe the people who stood closest to the blast? There's a park in Ozersk with stone memorials, names etched as if names could hold back the wind. There are classrooms where teachers whisper cautionary lessons without using the words that would get them in trouble 40 years ago. There are kitchens where grandmothers still boil water because it feels safer, even if the taps are clean. History isn't fate. It's maintenance, repairing what can be repaired, admitting what cannot, and protecting those who did not get a choice. The lesson of TChelyabinsk-40 isn't that secrecy is always evil or that science is always dangerous. It's that truth delayed is damage multiplied. Close your eyes and picture the Urals in winter. Pines iced with hoarfrost, the air so dry it crackles, and far in the distance a fence line that seems to run forever. Somewhere behind it, a dosimeter still ticks. Not loud, just enough to say, I'm here. If you ever visit the Urals, you won't see Chelyabinsk-40 on the highway signs. But if you listen carefully, the past is still speaking, and it's asking us to do better next time. Subscribe to DarkCurio for more hidden history and forbidden places.